The SAT writing and language section is 4 passages. You have 35 minutes, which works out to 8 minutes, 45 seconds per passage. So one thing to keep in mind in general is just make sure that you read the entire passage. Don't try to skip to the questions. Even where there are no questions in the passage, there's still important information in that text. So that's where you're learning about the style and tone of the passage, what person the passage is written in, and also what the passage is about. All of that is stuff that you need to know to answer the questions well when you come to them. So about those questions, they fall into 2 broad categories. You have grammar and punctuation questions, and you have rhetorical skills questions. Those rhetorical skills questions, that's where you're doing things like adding or deleting sentences from a paragraph, picking a sentence that will introduce the topic of a paragraph, combining 2 sentences into 1 sentence, correcting for style and tone, sometimes rearranging the order of sentences in a paragraph. So things like that. A couple things to keep in mind for those types of questions. Number 1, shorter is better. It's not always the case that the shortest answer is the correct answer on the SAT, but usually if you're stuck between 2 answer choices, just go with a shorter one. It's, again, not always going to be right, but it's a good rule of thumb, and it tends to be the case that shorter answer will be right. When you're doing style and tone questions, remember that the tone of all these passages is just somewhere in the kind of a middle ground. So nothing too fancy, nothing too formal. When you're combining 2 sentences into 1, and it comes up, I think, in a couple of other ways also, but the SAT really prefers the standard English sentence structure of subject, verb, object, direct object. So anytime that structure is available in an answer choice, it's usually the right one. It's not always available, but if you can find something that's closest to that, or at least has the fewest dependent clauses tacked onto it, that's usually the way to go. In this category of question, you're also going to have a lot of questions that will ask you to either add or delete information from a paragraph, or choose a sentence that will introduce the topic of a paragraph or relate to the paragraph in some other way. So my recommendation for doing these types of questions is to identify the topic of the sentence at issue and the topic of the paragraph that sentence will fit into. If those 2 topics are the same, the sentence belongs. If those 2 topics are different, the sentence does not belong. And this is a skill that I hope sounds pretty simple. It really is pretty simple, but it does take a little bit of practice and probably some more explanation than just that. And but I'll get into that in another video. But something to keep in mind, at least as a place to get started. The other thing that you're going to see is questions that will give you a specific task to complete. Like they'll say which answer choice emphasizes the size of whatever we're talking about, or that it took a long time to do X, Y, or Z. And then you just want to fulfill that task as literally and directly as possible, really without any other consideration, just kind of robotically. Doesn't sound like a good thing to do. But remember, this is a standardized test. The answer has to be objectively correct. And those types of questions, you can take for granted that the grammar and punctuation and those other considerations are correct. You don't have to worry about that. You just want to fulfill that task as literally and directly as you possibly can. So just remember, in general, for this type of question, it's not your job to make the passage more interesting or to write it the way you would like to write it. You want to answer those questions. You just need to answer those questions correctly, whatever the question is. So there's lots of other stuff to get into, but that's a start for those rhetorical skills questions. As far as the grammar questions, grammar and punctuation, remember that you can't trust your ear. That's really the biggest thing. The SAT knows that most people will do their grammar and punctuation just by the way things sound. And so they've very cleverly come up with questions where your ear will mislead you. So where the right answer kind of sounds wrong. So the only way to get around that and to not fall into that trap is to know your grammar and punctuation rules. The good thing is that's actually not that hard to learn them. And the way that they come up on the SAT is not that complicated, not as complicated as some of the situations you'll encounter out in the real world. Remember, again, it's a standardized test. The answer has to be objectively correct, and the wrong answers have to be objectively wrong. So everything is black and white, which really is a good thing because there's no ambiguity. So you should be able, if you know those rules, you should be able to look at all of your answer choices and say 3 out of those 4 are definitely wrong for this reason, and this one is correct for this reason. Which I guess brings me to another point. If you're going to use punctuation, know why you're using it. So this is the same thing. You can't just go by, well, it sounds good, I thought there should be a little pause here. No, there's a specific rule that demands a piece of punctuation be used in a certain situation. And if you're going to use punctuation, you have to know why you're using it. So once you know those rules, this, again, is not so hard. But you need to get used to looking at things through that lens. And another thing, in general, less punctuation, just like the shorter answers, typically better. The answer with less punctuation is usually better. So it's not always the case, again, that the answer choice with the least punctuation is correct. But usually if you're kind of debating between 2 answer choices and one has less punctuation than the other, go with the one with less. It's not always going to be right, but the majority of the time it will be. So there are lots of, just like with the rhetorical skills questions, there are lots of specific grammar type questions that will come up and that I will address in some other videos. But for now, this is a good place to start, and I hope it helps.